We have in today's readings a very fascinating approach to various forms of illness, all forms of illness that create in themselves a certain isolation, a certain distancing, a certain withdrawal. The person, when we're sick, we just don't feel a part of things. We feel, as some people say, I don't feel myself. And sometimes because we don't feel ourselves, we don't want to even present ourselves in public because we don't want people to see us ill. It's a kind of a natural reaction. And the way in which we see in the Old Testament, they're talking about leprosy. That's the buzzword. But we know that often when that term is used in the Bible, it can refer to many, many different forms of illness, usually the types of illness that present themselves on the surface, like as a pustule or as a wound or as an open sore, because it's very, very obvious that the person is sick. We all know that there are many other forms of illness that never manifest themselves perhaps so graphically, but that we carry within ourselves. Even a diagnosis of some disease. It doesn't necessarily have to be cancer. It could be, but it could be something else as well, too, something that is insidious, that doesn't appear on the surface. But it doesn't change the fact that we carry that illness within ourselves very, very deeply. And I would venture to say that all of us at some point in our lives have experienced something like that as well. Some of us may be carrying burdens within ourselves, and as Mary mentioned today, it could be the burden of abuse of some form. It could be sexual abuse, but it could be other forms of abuse, some form of violence, some scar, some trauma that we experienced, some awful thing that we witnessed. May not have happened directly to us, but we might have been in the presence of somebody that something terrible happened to, and maybe we never told anybody about it. Maybe it happened years and years ago, but the memory still remains, the scar still remains. So I think that all of us in some way can find a way of identifying with the person who in some way has experienced some form of horrible thing that happened to them. And it's interesting because we see different approaches to this, and it probably is very difficult for us to hear how this was dealt with under the law of Moses in the Old Testament, that the person, first of all, was noted. You're sick. There's something wrong with you. Stay away. And not only is the person advised to stay away, but they always have to say wherever they go, I'm unclean, I'm unclean. Don't come near, don't come near. Where is there any hope of healing? And it seems like the only hope of healing is if it somehow goes away. Well, how is it going to go away? The recipe isn't there. There's nothing there that says how that person is going to get rid of that stain, get rid of that illness, get rid of that pustule. Now, we see a ray of hope in the second reading from St. Paul. St. Paul is encouraging people to come closer, not to go away, not to fear, not to stay in the margins. Well, it's not always easy. And St. Paul himself knows what he's talking about because until his conversion, St. Paul was taking that same approach. If there's something wrong, get rid of it, cut it off, amputate it, deny it, suppress it, push it away. St. Paul was going in to gatherings of Christians and literally pulling people out of the synagogues. Anybody that proclaimed the name of Jesus, casting them away. And finally, when he's knocked off his high horse and told by Jesus, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Because when you send people away, when you drive them out, you're persecuting me. When you exclude anybody from the communion of saints that Jesus has founded, Jesus wants everyone to be saved, everyone to be healed, everyone to feel a part, to be included. And St. Paul suddenly realizes that this is the will of Jesus. But it's not something that immediately is obvious what that entails. Of course, we see in the gospel today, and we see how it does happen. And what does Jesus do? He sees this leper. He sees this person that is regarded as unclean, as an outcast, the person that you're not supposed to come near to. And what does he do? He goes up to that man and he touches him. He lays his hand upon him, something that no priest would do, no Old Testament priest would dare touch. Why? Because by so doing, he would become unclean himself. Did you know that? Jesus becomes ritually unclean himself. He becomes the illness of that leper when he touches him. The same thing. But why should that surprise us? When we know exactly what Jesus did when he climbed on that cross and was convicted and killed, murdered as a victim himself, as a sinner himself. Even though he never sinned. He becomes one like us in all things but sin, even to the point of a horrible, horrible death. What is that telling us? Well, it's telling us one thing, that no matter how ill we are, no matter how much we've been pushed down, no matter how low we've descended, no matter how low we've been pushed, either by our own sins or somebody else's, is never too far for Jesus to go and to encounter us. He meets us exactly where we are. He touches us exactly where that pain is. And whether it's in our hearts, whether it's in our minds, whether it's on our bodies, someplace, Jesus, the divine physician, comes there to be with us and to embrace us and to welcome us into the loving arms of God's mercy. What that tells us is that no matter how far we may have fallen or been pushed, Jesus is there with us. Why? Because he wants each and every one of us to be saved. Each and every one of us to be healed. And that means that no matter what has happened to us, we are more than our past. We have a future. You know, you've heard the expression that every saint had a past, but every sinner has a future. So there's hope for each and every one of us, whatever our hurt may be, whatever our history may be, whatever has happened to us. That is where Jesus wants to come to us to heal us. It shouldn't surprise us, you know, when we listen to the scriptures, there's so many, many different layers to the gospel. And I always say whenever I preach, my hope is that my words may not get in the way of your hearing the message that Jesus has for your heart. And if you want to hear that message, my hope is that you will. I see a homily as kind of a three-way street. What I may say, what you may hear, and what God does in between. And I don't want to have any control over that. I only want God to hear what you need to hear. I want you to hear the healing message that at this moment in your life you need to hear. And not only just hear it, but to absorb it into your whole being. And you may know that in this exercise here, that we have the eternal God, the all-loving God that wants to reach your heart, your soul and mind, that wants us to be changed and transformed in the way that we most need at this point, because that's what Jesus is all about. He's all about transformation, all about change, all about healing, all about hope, all about possibility. Why? Because you and I are made for eternity. You and I are made to be much more than anything that happens to us. You and I are made to be citizens of heaven and to enjoy an eternity with the Lord of all. Another way that I've heard this that left a deep impression on me, I think it came from a nun. I've often spoken of this. I don't even remember her name, but she said, you know, Jesus would have died for you if you were the only person in the world. I never forgot that. Each and every one of us, without exception, from the person closest to the altar to the person in the last pew. And I have a friend of mine, her name is Teresa, and she speaks often about her journey back to the faith, to the church, after a long history of terrible abuse. And she remembers how little by little, she found herself gradually coming back into the church, never when the lights were on. She would come into this church not too far from where she worked. She worked on Wall Street. It may have been Our Lady of Victory, I don't know. It may not have even been a Catholic church. But she found her way into a church that somehow or other, it was safe enough for her to sit in the corner. And she remembers how she would do just that. She would find a place where nobody else could see her, where she could be alone. But there was something about that sense of presence. Somebody was there. Maybe it was the sanctuary candle that we always have in every church that reminds us of the real presence of Jesus there in that tabernacle. And she would watch, and she just had that sense that somehow or other there was someone here. And of course, all that would have to happen is somebody would have to come out, and particularly if it was a priest, because she was abused by a priest, and all she'd need to do was see that Roman collar, and she'd go scurrying away. It would trigger her. But little by little, she kept coming back. And finally, one day, she doesn't know why, but she just got this sense and said, you know what? I'm not going to let any man, any other human being, interfere with my love for God and God's love for me. That was a grace. That was a grace, almost a miracle. In fact, it was a miracle. But for her to come to that point, to be able to say so courageously, I believe that Jesus is here, even though I may not see his presence in all of the people here. But I'm not going to let them stand in the way. I'm going to trust. And little by little, through prayer and trust, she made her way back. Oh, she still feels the pain. She still has the memories. And it took a long time for her, and she still struggles with it. But she came to recognize that somehow in this church, with all of its sinners, with all of its imperfections, and with all of its terrible history at times, that somehow or other, God is here, and he's not going to let us go. God is not going to abandon us. God is going to come back to us. We see so many examples of that in the scripture. The parable of the good shepherd that goes after the lost sheep and leaves the 99 who do not need immediate attention, because Jesus has in his heart a care for that sheep which is most distant. If you feel like that sheep at times, and I think we all do at times, like that lost sheep, there's good news. Jesus has his eye on your heart, and he's not going to let you go.